Dear participants to the Basel Peace Forum, very happy to be back with you again for the second last part of this first half day, for this panel of the day, as we call it. And the idea of this panel of the day is to provide a short recap, not of all the items which were discussed this afternoon. This wouldn't by far be possible, not even of all overarching topics, but just of 3 items which were discussed and processed either in a workshop or in a side panel this afternoon. And for this, I have the pleasure to welcome with me on this panel Maureen Achieng. Maureen Achieng, welcome. Welcome again. And I have to say that we had you, as all the others, in other events already this afternoon. And there was a technical communication problem with you. And I want to apologize. It was on our side in Switzerland, as you are based in Ethiopia. Some people might think it would be on a different continent, but the problem was in the midst of Europe, not in the European Union, but in the midst of Europe. So sorry again for this technical inconveniences. I'm very confident we will be better off for this panel of the day with you. Maureen is head of a special mission of the International Organization for Migration to Ethiopia, and she's also representative of the IOM to the African Union, to IGAD, and to the Economic Commission for Africa. Then we have, as a second participant in this panel of the day, Boaz Hameiri. Boaz Hameiri is a senior lecturer at the University of Tel Aviv. He is working there with a mediation and conflict program at the University of Tel Aviv. Boaz, you were just 15 minutes ago still on another panel, so welcome again. I hope you had time to at least have a coffee or a sip of orange juice in between. And last but not least, I welcome Charles Heller. Charles Heller is a researcher and filmmaker. He's affiliated with different universities, both in Switzerland and in the UK. And he's also part of the forensic architecture team of Eyal Weizmann, based in London. Welcome, Charles, with us here also for this panel of the day. As I've been doing it in a preceding panel this afternoon, I introduce the participants in a certain sequence, and then I give them the word in the reversed sequence. So we'll start first with Charles, and then move on to Boaz, and then to Maureen. To just from your point of view, it doesn't need to be exhaustive at all, but from your point of view, what were the most important points which came up in the discussions you had, either with your fellow panelists or in exchange with participants? What you think would be worthwhile bringing in here to this panel of the day? Just a few minutes. Charles, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Laurent. Well, of course, it's very challenging to summarize, 3 hours of conversations and exchange, which were really rich. But first, I want to mention the really inspiring and moving work that Arne Macic, who is an architect and was on a panel with on which I was also a participant. She presented the work that she's been doing in Mostar, both looking at the way architecture was implicated in the war in former Yugoslavia, but also the way she sought to intervene through the means of architecture, for example, by proposing a monument to the Mostar Bridge and the practice of diving from that bridge, shared by the different and separated populations that live in Mostar today. And this was a really inspiring and moving presentation, which I think, like my own, in a sense, converges around the idea that architecture is really also a tool for research, for spatial analysis, which is attuned to space, but also materiality, but also the way architecture operates symbolically in our societies. And crucially, is geared also at not only at analysis, but also at intervention. And this is something that I also try to share in relation with my own project, Forensic Oceanography, within which we've tried to develop methods to document the violations of migrants' rights at sea. And today we're expanding to other border zones within the practice of border forensics. And the workshop that I led, I hope, allowed to introduce participants to some of the challenges that we face, the questions that we face, both understanding the complex causes of border deaths and thinking about what traces those deaths may leave, how they can be spatialized, and what are the tools to seek accountability for them. But last but not least, I think that we really did raise also the question of how borders, how migration policies need to be transformed so that border violence is durably brought to an end.
Thank you very much, Charles. So for the other two, this was a perfect match in terms of essential, interesting points and timing. Boaz, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about our work. So just to try to summarize quickly the panel that we had this afternoon, just before this panel. So we started with Professor Laurent to just give us a broad overview. And I think that this broad overview summarizes very nicely what we're trying to do in this panel. So what Laurent started from is that there is this seeming paradox in the Israeli society, the Jewish Israeli society, and also in the Palestinian society, which is that while it seems that nobody thinks that the peace is achievable and nobody really talks about it as part of the ongoing elections that has been going on in Israel for the past few years, at the same time, large-scale surveys show that many Israelis and also many Palestinians actually support different compromises that can lead to conflict resolution. And so the reason for that, according to Iran and according to this perspective, is not that there is something that is unachievable, that peace is not achievable because the differences between the sides is just too big or something along these lines. The reason for the continuation of the conflict is the psychological barriers that maintain the conflict. So that's basically the basic premise from which we think about our work. And so if we think that this is the case, then the next step is what can we do as social psychologists, as researchers, in order to try to change the situation. So we move away from this position as researchers that we try to understand the world, that we're trying to understand psychological processes, and we move to a situation in which we're trying to actually use that in order to devise interventions in order to change people's attitudes and promote conflict resolution. And so Laurent continued and said that we have three assumptions that is based in this process. First is that public opinion matters, right? We're trying to make a change from the bottom up, right? Change people's perspectives and then move up to policymakers and decision makers. The second assumption is that when trying to persuade individuals, it's usually not effective enough because in this context of harsh and prolonged conflict, people are very resistant to this type of information, and that classic interventions in this context are sometimes less effective. And so from that, we presented three different interventions. I won't obviously go into depth into all of them, but they were all based on this assumption. And they were all based on the idea that we need to take these ideas, try to test them as rigorously as we can in the lab, and then try to take them out, collaborate with people on the ground to actually make a meaningful change in the world, and to try to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically because the research that we present today was mostly about that.
Thank you very much, Boaz, for this excellent resume. And now moving to Maureen. Even though you skipped part of the panel we both had the pleasure to participate in, I think you still got the essential points. So from your perspective, in your point of view, what were the essential messages which were communicated in this exchange, or the most important point you see should be further discussed? And before, Maureen, before letting you talk, let me remind the participants that you can start asking questions already now in the boxes which are foreseen, so that we do have enough questions when we get to the short Q&A part. Because if you don't ask questions, I always have ideas for questions, and that's a pity, because the participants should have the idea to ask questions. Sorry, Maureen, now it's yours.
Thank you, Laurent. And you'll actually be surprised how much I missed of the essence of the discussion. I think what I listened in most on was the introduction, where the other panelists spoke to the question of why they accepted to participate in this forum. And on that point, I think all the other three, actually all four panelists, were there for all the right reasons, wanting to influence the debate and thinking on these issues, but equally wanting to learn from a community of practice on how migration and peace and security issues interlink. I then missed out on a long stretch, but came in again at a very interesting point in the discussion, where the focus was on integration and the links between integration and insecurity, integration of migrants, that is, into their host societies. And the big question was, how far should that integration go if it's to address the issues that arise from lack of integration? Should it include political rights? And I think the general view was that while this is desirable, it isn't always as straightforward as that. It would be surprising how many countries in varied contexts would have a challenge with ensuring political rights for immigrants. This is probably something that doesn't happen within one generation, but may take a little longer. It's not as simple as that. It begins to touch on very sensitive national identity issues for many host societies. I then, and you'll forgive me, Laurent, for focusing more on what I said, because I know more what I said than what the others say, given the technical difficulties. But the relationship between migration, peace, and security is a complex one. And nothing illustrates it more on the African continent than the current discussions regarding the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the Free Movement Protocol, two key African Union decisions that are intended to move Africa stridently toward continental integration, economic integration at this point. And in deliberating on the how, a lot of questions have been asked about how these two twin protocols will be impacted by peace and security, and in turn also impact peace and security. Will the AFCFTA and the Free Movement Protocol work because there is peace and security, or is the fact of there not being peace and security going to mean that they don't work at all? Or will the non-implementation of these twin protocols exacerbate the incidence of peace and security because they starve the continent of the opportunity to avail of the economic benefits that could arise from a more integrated continent? And we see it. We see the reluctance on free movement and the enthusiasm for free trade on the continent So again, we see Africa mimicking a lot of the fears around immigration as we see in the West. And a lot of peace and security issues surround this fear. I would, if I had had more time, I would have gone on to say the following. So I'll use this forum to say it, which is that a holistic approach is needed to addressing these issues, because while this forum is looking at the links between peace and security and migration, we should also take account of the fact that a lot of the causes of peace and security lie in the economic realm. Some of them are linked to, especially on this continent, to climate change and the growing impact of environmental degradation. So the issues are intertwined and complex, and they're myriad. It's not a simple relationship between migration and security. There's a whole host of other factors that come into play. So this discussion, Laurent, this is not to minimize the importance of the topic that the Basel Peace Forum has selected, but rather to highlight the further interlinkages with other domains that will have a very direct impact on the issues we're discussing at this forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So happy to talk to you without interruptions, technical interruptions. And let me just take up the last point you mentioned to start into our panel discussion. Actually, I mean, it is the objective, even the core objective of not the core objective, but the core assumption premise of the Basel Peace Forum is to look at peace in a broad way, or in a much broader way that it is usually being done. Not criticizing the other ways, you know. Of course, mediation, transitional justice, issues linked to fragility of states are of crucial importance to international politics, peace and security. But the assumption is that there is much more in it, and that linking up to other spheres, other actors, other groups in society could enhance the potential of peace building written large. Yes, linking up to the very type of issues you just mentioned. You know, in the economic sphere, in the sphere of the environment. Of course, we cannot link up to all the issues. Otherwise, you know, it would be like nothing. But we really try in each year's edition to focus and deepen one or the other aspect. So I really fully agree and appreciate the last remark you made. And to move on along these lines, you know. In my perspective, and I also understood the colleagues in your panel this afternoon a little bit into this direction, migration, of course, is a hot political potato, to call it like this. Yeah, but at the same time, it is a bridge. Yeah, it is a bridge because people migrate. Yeah, and they start from a place and they move to another place. And if this move occurs more or less safely and to the benefit of the people who do so, it can also have a connecting function, bringing the places of departure and the places of landing, to say so, together, and also bringing up new items and new issues. So did I understand you correctly, you know, that you say, well, looking at migration is the beginning, but it could also be, besides the security-related elements, which could help solve certain problems, also be the beginning of more exchanges and interactions in different policy fields. Was this part of what you were saying?
Absolutely, Laurent, that's correct. I say that, but I say a lot more, which is that, or I would like to say a lot more, which is that viewing migration ought not to be viewed as a problem. Migration has to be embraced as a fact of life. It's what we humans have always done since the dawn of time. We've always migrated from where there were fewer opportunities to where there were more opportunities. Migration has become the hot potato issue that it is in today's world because one could argue, the rise of the nation state. So there are borders, there are travel documents, there are rules regarding entry and exit into other states that are not your own as a national. So the world has become a lot more complex, but that is not going to get rid of a fact of life, as migration is. Migration is a problem if it is not well managed. Migration is an immense opportunity, taking account of the fact that so many people are on the move. Migration is an opportunity if well managed. And here I would like to point to the Economist Intelligence Unit report 2 years ago that came up with this finding that I just think is of such huge magnitude. I'm surprised it's not spoken about in more forums, that a world of free movement would be $78 trillion richer. So in a sense, the issues that we're dealing with around, the challenges that we're dealing with around migration have to do with the fact that the walls to the legal pathways for migration are being erected higher and higher, and thereby creating a lot of the problems that we witness with smugglers and traffickers being at the center of matching labor supply to demand rather than governments. A good place to get to is a place where we have governments at the center of managing this process and not the criminals. And then really looking at the interlinkages between migration and other policy spheres. The interactions are myriad, the interactions are complex, and fully agree with you, Laurent, we can't look at everything, but we can endeavor to make as many of these linkages as possible with a view to reaching solutions that address the fundamental drivers of the negative sort of migration, which again, sadly, is the one that's given most visibility in international media. It's not the positive migration we hear stories about, but again, it is that negative migration that we need to tackle. And tackling it means looking at the issues in more complex terms. And sometimes the problem is not where you're looking at it, but lies elsewhere. So again, making those connections, bringing in the different policy experts so that a holistic view is taken and the fundamental drivers of irregular migration can begin to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So questions are starting to come in, and one is directed, I think, to Boaz Hameiri. Well, asking basically, if conflicts are just about psychological paradox, why don't we have psychologists solve all the conflicts in the world? I mean, the question is not exactly phrased like this, but it's going a little bit into this direction. So, I mean, getting back to what you reported from your panel, of course, it wasn't a general statement to all conflicts. I mean, we fully understood. I mean, it was based on particular research, empirically sound-based research. But the fact that actually, I mean, if I'm paraphrasing a bit and accentuating a bit, being aware that we are getting towards the end of this intense half day of the Basel Peace Forum. I mean, if a lot is about psychological barriers and many more people at the group level, at least, would be in favor of more compromise than we witness in the public. I mean, would this be really a way to go, to how to say, it would be kind of educating people in a certain direction? Would it be in terms of making visible to them the fact that actually many compromises lie in the air, but they are not being materialized, they're not being implemented because of certain psychological barriers? I mean, is this right? Is this going along the points discussed and researched by your group, or is this too extreme?
I think that psychological barriers have a lot of influence in resolving conflicts. In many of the courses that we teach and talks that we give, we start from this quote from I forgot his name now.
Never mind.
Sorry.
Never mind the name.
Yeah, from the Egyptian president. His name slipped my mind. That said, that when he came to talk in front of the Israeli parliament, that he thinks that peace is achievable, but what lies between achieving peace and the current situation between Egypt and Israel is psychological barriers, the mistrust, the hatred, the fear, and all of these things, and also Sadat, of course. Sorry about that.
Anwar al-Sadat was the name, I guess you were looking for, yeah?
Yeah. Just remembered. And so he said that he thinks that this is maybe 70 or 80% of the reason why the two nations cannot achieve peace, right? And so I don't know if this is the number. I don't know if it's 80 or 70%. I don't know if it's a little bit less or a little bit more, but I do think, according to our research and other people's research, that it plays a very meaningful role in the process. And I can also say that I was involved a while ago in some research in which we interviewed different people who were at the crossroads of different peace processes that happen in various places around the world. So in Northern Ireland, in South Africa, in Israel and Palestine as well. And many of these people who, again, were practitioners, policymakers, people who were inside the rooms where everything happened, said that they think that psychological barriers are also key in understanding intergroup conflicts, and also key in trying to promote conflict resolution, trying to reach compromises, trying to negotiate, etc. So again, I don't know exactly the number, but I do think that it's really important to take these into account, these barriers into account.
Thank you, Boaz. Charles, now listening to these elements, I mean, your work, as far as I understand, is also a contribution in making visible in a different way what happens in certain spaces in the world. Yes, so it's partly a reconstruction, but it's also reconceptualization. It's maybe also naming spaces as such which might not be labeled like this in a regular speech, and through this also making them more accessible to different views through different conceptions. Now, linking it to trying to link it to this psychological barrier debate we had with Boaz. I mean, could one see what you are doing with forensic architecture, but also with border forensics, and as one step, as maybe a contribution to opening up new perspectives to groups, also to involved groups, to see things differently, which might also have an impact on what's happening in the policy or political field, or is this a distortion of your research?
Thanks, Laurent. No, it's not at all a distortion, but let me try to respond to that and somehow connect also to some of the elements that were shared with us by Maureen and Boaz. I mean, you could say that in a way we start from a slightly opposed premise in relation to what you described. In a way, we see that European migration policies in particular are really at this point and since several years really blocked. They're unable to really offer a frame for migration to unfold in a legal way, in a way that accepts the normality of migration. And in here, I absolutely join Maureen. And this generates conflicts because it simply clashes with the very reality of the dynamics of migration between Europe and global South. So transforming policies is, of course, very challenging. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is to document violation, seek accountability for these violations so as to block particularly violent bordering practices. And if you will, increase the cost of those restrictive migration policies, also as a way to, if you will, incentivize states into changing their policies. Now, I think this remains an important task, and I will continue to undertake this task in the future. But I also see that documenting violations and seeking accountability is not quite enough. Let me take a very simple example. In 2012, the European Court of Human Rights condemned Italy in its Hameiri judgments for its pushbacks practices on the high seas, i.e. direct pushbacks operated by Italian vessels bringing back migrants towards Libya. Well, as a fellow colleague analyzed, Itamar Mann, in fact, Italy and the EU took this judgment as almost a manual for its next violent practice, i.e. what it operates today, refoulement by proxy, by re-erecting the Libyan Coast Guard and outsourcing interceptions and refoulement to these actors. So the point here is that documenting violations, seeking accountability is not enough as long as the enduring and systemic conditions that generate this mobility conflict are not addressed. And let me just, if you will, I don't want to be too long, but pick two things that Maureen mentioned. I absolutely agree that we need a holistic approach to migration. And that is not the approach that the EU is taking at present. The EU claims to adopt a global approach to migration, but it is leaving entirely unaddressed the root causes of restrictive EU migration policies, of European racism, of xenophobia, and is only tackling what it constructs as the problem of migration from the global South towards Europe. So that is really fundamental, a really holistic approach, not the one-sided holistic approach that we have at present. I also join Maureen's call for policies founded on the reality of migrants' movements and that give a frame for that reality of migration to unfold. And finally, maybe a last call that I would add to that is the call by French philosopher Etienne Balibar to democratize borders. Migration policies today are fundamentally undemocratic in the sense that they involve defining policies and laws imposed on people, migrants, who have no say in their definitions. If we want truly just policies, we need to involve migrants themselves in the definition of the policies that concern them. And I think that is fundamental. No conflict can be brought to an end if the different parties involved are not consulted in a fair and adequate manner.
Thank you very much, Charles. Going back to Boaz and trying again to bring two things together, as is the idea of this panel of the day. Charles mentioned EU policies of selected states in Europe. So I mean, these states are democracies, different understandings of democracies, but let's say there are quite democratic states and structures. So governments don't just take decisions on their own, usually also not EU decision makers or bureaucrats, particularly not in this field, because they are very sensitive to the interest of member states. So if we would adapt what you said and to what Charles said, or the other way around, never mind. What could also think, and also taking into account what Maureen said at the origin, that even though it's not a violent conflict in a sense that we have two or more armed groups fighting each other, I mean, there are conflicts and there are casualties and deaths, many deaths, people in the realm of migration exchanges between Europe and other parts of the world, particularly southern parts of this world. Maybe there would be a compromise in the air also there, and working on these psychological issues within groups, particular groups in European countries, could not change automatically, but make visible certain alternative pathways to different type of policies. Would this fit your kind of thinking?
Yes, definitely. So the short answer is yes. And there's actually quite a bit of research exactly on that. So I'm personally a conflict resolution researcher. I study intergroup conflicts, violent conflicts, usually intractable conflicts, so conflicts that are prolonged and violent. But there are many, many other researchers across Europe, across the US, and in other places around the world, in Australia, in South Africa, and also in Africa, that try to understand what are the sources of intergroup prejudice, and also what are the why different host countries that receive or get a large number of immigrants, why are the people, the populace, the people that live there, why are they negative, or why do they have negative views towards the immigrants that come there? So Charles and Maureen touched several of these reasons. And again, I'm not an expert on that specifically, but I can say that at the end of the day, the same approaches that we find to be effective in leading to attitude change and resolving psychological barriers in the context of violent intergroup conflicts are also relevant to these type of contexts. And there's quite a bit of research showing that. But what I also think that we should take into account when we think about that is, so when we think about interventions in general, we first try to understand what are the psychological barriers, or what are the underlying psychological mechanisms that exacerbate conflict. And so the same way we can look at a context and understand why, psychologically speaking, why people that live in a certain country, let's say in Europe, reject or have negative views towards immigrants. And through that, we can try to develop different interventions that can specifically tackle these psychological mechanisms. So just one example that I can give that actually is related to the conflict in Colombia and FARC ex-combatants reintegration there. And so we've done research there, and we try to understand why the Colombian populace is actually quite negative, or has quite negative views towards this process, this reintegration process of FARC ex-combatants. And we found, for example, that they think that after years of conflict, they don't think that FARC ex-combatants can change and reintegrate peacefully into the Colombian society. And so when we thought about how to develop intervention, we thought specifically about that as our target belief or attitude to change. So similarly, I think that you can do the same thing in the context of attitudes towards refugees or immigrants, and try to understand what is that lies underneath these negative perceptions that many people have, and then try to come up with an intervention that can actually target that specifically, be targeted.
Thank you very much, Boaz. Maureen, now I will get back to you and actually give you the remaining few minutes of this panel, but with two questions. Yeah? There's no free lunch. So two questions, and the first one is what do you think of what we just discussed with Boaz and Charles? You know, I mean, yourself not being an active researcher in this field, but having listened to this idea that basically an agreement or a change in policy now regarding migration would be reachable. That it's much less, I don't know, hard facts or material elements which would prevent finding a solutions than certain perspectives of a psychological type. Yes, and the second question, you know, changes may happen or not. Sometime nothing will happen tomorrow. So in the meantime, and this would be the final part of this exchange. You know, how do you see ways, possibilities on this migration security nexus to improve the conditions of migrants? You know, concretely, this is relating to a question we got from a participant. You know, people who cannot be relocated, who will not make it to Europe. I mean, how could we improve their situation in a meaningful but still realistic way? Are there items, instruments which you're working on it, which could be implemented rapidly? So I know these are two large questions. You have 4 minutes. I know you will manage.
Thank you very much, Laurent. I hope I can rise to the challenge of responding to those two very big questions. First off, I could not agree more with Boaz on the issue of psychological barriers. We might disagree on what percentage of the intractability of the problem has to do with the psychological barrier rather than a real barrier. But I think we surely can agree that psychological barriers play a central part in a lot of the intractable problems in the world today. In no sphere could it be more true than in the migration sphere, in my experience. And this brings me to a point that is often not talked about, which is the, without coming across as too harsh, the absence of political courage that makes it impossible for some of these difficult discussions to be had, to educate populations on the benefits of well-managed migration so that there is openness and so that politicians are able to take a long-term view on migration, and short-termism, which continues to characterize a lot of migration policy making, can be done away with. We need to have more honest conversations around migration, and having these conversations will bring down the psychological barriers that Boaz made reference to. But for the moment, I have to say there's a dearth of political courage, be it in countries of the global north, many of whom are key countries of destination for economic migrants, be it in countries of the south, who themselves are receiving a lot of migrants, because even here in Africa, there's countries that are wealthier than others. And there's a lot of African migrants moving from less wealthy countries to more wealthy countries. So this is not a problem of the global north. It's, I think, a problem of a failure of the imagination of the human species to imagine a better world, imagine a way in which we could embrace what is and always has been a fact of life. And to your second question, Laurent, how would we improve the conditions of migrants, make their conditions better? I mean, I think my response would be, can we work towards a world where people move as a choice and not out of desperate necessity? And to do so, I think we have to begin again to, how do I put this? We need to imagine a different global migration governance regime, one that allows countries that need the labor to procure it through regular channels rather than have the sectors within their countries use the facilities provided by smugglers and traffickers to avail of that labor. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. We need to put governments at the center. And if governments do not fail to take on that role, they say nature abhors a vacuum, smugglers and traffickers will. And this, unfortunately, is what is happening in much of the world. Both Charles and Boaz came up with quotations. I don't have a quotation to leave you with, but I have this one anecdote. There's a film, Adu, ADU is the name of the film. It's about a young boy in some fictional West African country who tries to make his way to Europe using the services of many different smugglers and traffickers. And watching that movie sums up everything that is wrong with migration governance today. The movie captures the impact of corruption in the developing world, and the actors in corruption are not just from Africa. I think that's important to underline. But it captures the impact of corruption, of poaching, of political instability, of economic deprivation, of environmental collapse in the life of this young boy, and sees how all of those factors add up to make him an irregular migrant who almost makes his way into Spain, but it is eventually captured. Again, I bring up this last anecdote just to underline that the problem is not just hardening borders. That's an easy solution, but it's not a solution that will get rid of the problem. It's a solution that will put a Band-Aid on the problem temporarily and make it look like something is happening while the real root causes are not being addressed. So I will stop on that note, Laurent, and urge both Charles and Boaz and yourself, Laurent, to look up Adu. It's a beautiful movie, well made, powerful message. And I think it just says it all. Thank you.
Maureen, thank you very much. I can, of course, only speak for myself, but I will look for this movie with pleasure. And I would like to thank you, Maureen, also Boaz and Charles, for this, for me, extremely interesting discussion and exchange on this panel of the day. As I had announced to you in advance, it's a premiere. I never did such a panel of the day, and I think it worked fine, even very fine. Of course, thanks to the three of you. So thank you for your contribution to the Basel Peace Forum this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it too, and I hope we will see you in one or the other of formats either later today or tomorrow. It would be a pleasure.